We are very, very excited this morning because we have Senator Ratna Omidvar with us today. She's a Canadian politician, of course, and an academic who was named to the Senate in 2016, representing the beautiful province of Ontario. She's very passionate about this charitable sector, and we are so grateful for all the work she has done, not only for Canadians, but us as a sector. So thank you so much, Senator. It is certainly my pleasure to have you here today. We want to engage you as well in this. We want you to use that engage tab for the viewing window so you can add questions for the senator today. We're going to have lots of time for questions, so don't be shy. We want to hear from you. This is meant to be really interactive. As we were chatting a little bit earlier before we got going this morning, the senator said that's her favorite part is questions from you. So let's give her lots to chat about. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Senator Omidvar. Hello, Senator.
Hello and good morning, Sam, and thank you for that enthusiastic opening. Voice and tone set the stage, and I'm so grateful for being invited to address this important community today, and secondly for being as Sam said, engagement will be key. So let me give you a high five as well. And I'm happy to say that I would have been completely on side with your choice, because I too would have voted for Ryan Reynolds. As I was preparing for my remarks, I remembered that I actually have some history with many in your profession, because I actually started my career in Canada as a fundraiser. I used to be a volunteer in downtown Toronto at a local settlement house, and we dreamt up a campaign to raise the princely sum of $800 to buy a triple stroller, or a series of triple strollers. Now, mind you, this was 1982, so conflate that figure significantly. And my contribution was I was going to read palms at the fair, and it was all goofy good fun. I have no qualifications, but we reached our goal. As one unintended outcome of that was that my enthusiasm for the task and for the work of the settlement house caught the eye of the executive director, and she offered me my first real job in Canada as a fundraiser. She did not ask for Canadian work experience. I guess she had seen me reading fortunes, and that was enough. And this set in effect a series of progressions in my life in the not-for-profit and charitable sector. I have really only worked in that sector before becoming a senator. I went on to lead organizations, to create new ones. I have served as a director of many. I ran a private foundation for many years. And then on to a university. And to think that it all started with reading fortunes and palms. Lots of water has, of course, flown under the bridge since then. But the theme of your conference and my talk brings forth another memory. In 2001, when I was president of Maytree, I convened the first ever funders network on racism and poverty. And many of the GTA's private and public foundations joined the effort. And our first meeting was, horrifically enough, held on September 11th of 2001. And we all know what went down there. And we talked a lot about what we wanted to do, and there was some moderate action. I remember the conversations about terminology. Were we going to name ourselves the Network on Race or the Network on Racism? And there's a difference. Gladly, we landed on the word racism. I'm not sure we actually got the traction we needed. We developed joint protocols for funding equity-seeking advocacy groups, but we never really did the hard work of turning the mirror on ourselves. And my assessment in those times was that we needed to take small steps before getting to the big ones. Fast forward to today, and I can only imagine what the context and narrative of today would have done to this effort 20 years ago. Timing, colleagues, is always everything. And the timing of the day leads me to make two observations, to share two observations with you that will frame my remarks. My first observation is that we accept that racism is part of the Canadian experience. We accept that systemic, individual, structural racism is very much part of our DNA. We accept that our past has been racist and that we must accept and understand the past before we move forward with action to remedy past wrongs. That's the first observation. The second observation is this, that even though we may not be individually racist, many of us benefit from the legacy of privilege that is accrued to us. I will offer myself up as an example. I grew up in middle-class India, and without being an active participant in the caste system of that country, my family's life was very much built on the privilege that accrued to us because of this racism against certain people. And I had privilege that accrued to me because of systemic discrimination. So we have a poll coming out now, and I'm going to ask you the question, do we in the audience accept that A, systemic racism is part of our history, and B, privileges that we enjoy may have their roots in racism? I'm curious to know your answer, because then either I'm in the right conference or the wrong conference. But if we are all in this together, there is another important question that follows, and it is this. If racism is indeed part of our DNA, and if we recognize that privilege has accrued to us because of racism, what then of philanthropy? To find the answer to this question and your role in it, let me take you on a bit of a journey on the hunt for systemic embedded racism in philanthropy. And this is not easy, because systemic racism of almost every kind will hide in unlikely places. It is hard to ferret out, and it is sometimes even hard to recognize. At times, it has had clear victims, as we well know, in terms of our treatment of Canada's Indigenous peoples, but at times it expresses itself in seemingly benign ways. And I'm going to start in an unusual place, the Income Tax Act. And for good reason, because it is in the Income Tax Act where you find deeply embedded expressions of colonialism, which are hard to recognize on the face of it. Let me start with the legally recognized definition of philanthropy, or what is deemed by law to be charitable. And lo and behold, you will find out that we do not actually have a definition of charity in Canada. Rather, we have 4 heads of charity: religion, education, relief of poverty, and other general purposes. And these are the same 4 heads that were handed down to Canada from Elizabethan times. And whilst the United Kingdom and others have gone on to reform their understanding of what is charitable in a modernized context, Canada, we still remain stuck in the past. You would think that most organizations engaged in public good would fit into some of these definitions, and you would be wrong. As for one example, let's take the relief of poverty. Our understanding of the relief of poverty is grounded in the old world construct of the rich giving to the poor to alleviate their suffering. Images of Lady Bountiful come to mind. And although organizations that relieve poverty, like food banks, are deemed charitable, those that seek to prevent poverty are not. So a credit counseling service, for example, which prevents people from falling into poverty, has been deemed by our courts to not be charitable, because you can relieve poverty under our charities law. You cannot prevent it. That is not charitable. So therefore, many equity-seeking groups, whether they focus on racial or Indigenous justice, likely do not qualify under these 4 heads of charity. And even when they apply for status and their application is rejected, they find little or no recourse in the courts, because appeals by organizations who have been denied charitable status are heard by a federal court, a court that reviews whether the Canadian Revenue Agency made a correct decision, but it is not able to call witnesses or subject matter expert. It basically undertakes a paper review. Not a single decision of the CRA has been overturned by the courts in this matter in the last 50 years. And this has 2 outcomes. First, there's litigation chill, in the sector because it is so prohibitively expensive to launch an appeal. And second, more important, is that the definition of charity has not evolved through court decisions. So we continue to be stuck in Elizabethan times. I know that many of you may be thinking, well, what makes this an expression of systemic racism? For a very simple reason, colleagues. It shuts the door on a new modernized definition, which takes racial injustice and inequity into account. It prevents organizations focusing on these issues from accessing charitably exempt donations, which accessing charitably exempt donations is, I imagine, much of your work. There is, of course, a solution. There's always a solution. As a politician, I'm finding out that there's always a solution. We can either legislate a definition of charity, or we can allow the Court of Appeals to move from the Federal Court of Appeal to the tax court, which is nimble, less expensive, and most importantly, is able to call witnesses. So my next poll question to you, colleagues, is it time to expand our legal definition of charity? Yes or no? Let me take you on to the next stop in our search for systemic racism. Again, I find it in the Dusty Income Tax Act, which stipulates how charities use their charitable dollars. And here is what the law says. It limits charities to spending their charitable dollars in two ways. First, charities can grant charitable dollars to another charity, such as in the case of private foundations who make grants to charities. Second, they can spend their charitable dollars to pursue their charitable purposes through their own activities, such as the Y, which operates its own programs. So far, so good, because these limits are in place to ensure that charitable dollars are spent on charitable activities. No one can argue with accountability. But what happens when a charity is best served by working with a non-charity, such as a not-for-profit, a co-op, a social enterprise, a local organization, or a civil society movement? This is where the real impact of the law is felt, because in this case, the CRA will demand that the charity owns and operates and is fully accountable for their spending as if these activities were their own, even when they are not. This in CRA language is called direction and control. The charity must direct and control the activities with a non-charity that they fund. And the impact is severe. Since many Indigenous organizations are not charities, they're not able to receive charitable donations. The same is true for racial justice organizations. It is no wonder that less than 6% of charitable dollars flow to Indigenous organizations, and I believe even less to BIPOC ones. The very organizations on the ground which seek to deal with the legacy of racism are barred from doing so. The impact is even more severe for Canada's international development charities, who must work with organizations thousands of miles away. If they choose to do so, they too must exercise direction and control over the partners. Academics and lawyers have concluded that this law is colonial, it is racist, and must be replaced. And I have tabled a bill in the Senate to do precisely that. My bill will replace the language of own activities with new language of accountability, which will both empower charities and yet hold them accountable. It is not an either or. So here's my third poll question. Do you support removing the own activities language in the Income Tax Act? I hope I have brought alive for you how the law, in a seemingly blind and impartial way, has a thunderbolt of unintended consequences on those very organizations and charities who want to change the status quo. So let me be sunny for a moment and assume that the government follows through and the law is changed. Will we then suddenly become more inclusive, more just? Will we eliminate racism in charities? Of course not. Government and legislation is only one part of the equation. The next part is our institutions. So I come to the institution, the construct of philanthropy as we know it. I believe very firmly that organized philanthropy is the safeguard for tax-protected public funds, which are in the hands of private institutions to further charitable purpose. It is not private money. It is not money that benefactors or philanthropists can treat as their own. It is public money. But because it is in private hands, there is very little accountability to the people. Elected politicians who spend public tax money are held to account in every election. The same does not apply to philanthropy. As a result, philanthropy has become a bastion of privilege. I'm not one of those, and there are those that argue that philanthropy is necessarily bad or inefficient. I don't hold that view. I have been witness to many enlightened investments by philanthropists, which have changed our society. Just as one example from my own past as a grant maker, I'm a particular fan of Roots of Empathy and Jump Math, both nation-building efforts, which have been successful because of philanthropy, and they are now being exported to other parts of the world. But it is time for a reset and for a rethink. What is the real purpose of philanthropy? Is it a vehicle to meet the interests of a donor, or is it a vehicle to meet the needs of society? I believe that Darren Walker, CEO and president of the Ford Foundation, who I'm going to cite extensively in this next section, said it best in his recent interview with 60 Minutes when he made the point that philanthropy is not about generosity. Generosity, he said, is insufficient. The real goal of philanthropy should be justice. Generosity is about the donor. When you give money, he says, to help a homeless person, you may feel good. Justice, on the other hand, is a deeper engagement where you actually ask, what are the reasons that put people out on the street? Generosity, he suggests, makes the donor feel good. Justice, on the other hand, implicates the donor. How many philanthropists, I ask, are engaging with systemic causes of injustice? And I think you, because you're in touch with philanthropy, you raise money, you provide services to your clients, I think you will be able to answer this next bold question. And it is this: is it time for philanthropy to turn itself into a force for justice? In addition, the persona of philanthropy reflects the world of power and privilege in Canada. And this is clear from a cursory look at who sits on the boards and who leads Canada's charitable and not-for-profit organizations. In the summer of this year, as the COVID crisis was upending our lives, there was also another call that resonated with Canadians, and that was a call to end racism and exclusion. This call is what prompted me to throw a challenge to the charitable sector, both charities and foundations, and I asked them to do a simple thing. I said to them, look at yourself in the mirror and tell us who you so see. I know the sector well. I have worked in it all my life and I respect it for what it is, but I also see its failings. Its persona is an old world persona. And even though the sector says all the right things, it has not moved the needle on inclusion on its own governance. And I summed it up as follows in an open letter to the sector. Your spirit is willing, but your flesh is weak. When push comes to shove, boards tend to appoint people like this themselves. In a subsequent survey done by Stats Canada, who heard this call, it was determined that whilst women were very well represented on boards of charities and not-for-profits, other groups such as Indigenous, BIPOC, and LGBTQ people were not. I call this the governance deficit. In addition, the survey determined that 47% of those surveyed said that their organization did not have a written diversity policy, and 23% simply did not know. I hope we all appreciate the difference in Canada that employment equity has made in our society. I propose that the time has come for governance equity. How to get there will be a combination of government and civil society interventions. Government must mandate the collection of data on governance on an annual basis. And the sector, I think, well, the sector must heal itself. Not aspirational and performative talk, but real action with real targets, timelines, and accountability. It is time for a shift or a sharing of power to make decisions made by people who have a connection to lived exclusion. But a warning here, tokenism is a deadly sin, and this must not be reduced to the ticking off of boxes. It needs to permeate not just the who of governance, but the how of it. I am struck by the subset of persona who may well be in this audience who advise philanthropy and charities on how to invest, how to manage risk, how to grant. Look at these persona as well to really search for the heart of philanthropy. So here's my fourth poll question. I was told I would be getting answers to the poll questions, but I'm not. So I'll just keep repeating them. So fourth poll question is, do you support the notion of governance equity on the boards of charities? When philanthropy works well, it is the R&D of society. It takes risks that governments cannot take. It is, so to say, the loss leader. But when it does work well, when it does not work well, it is flirtatious, it is personal, and in the very worst cases, it becomes a vehicle for hoarding wealth and influence. The rise of donor advice funds in Canada, the low disbursement quota rate, these are all expressions of a certain privilege. So how can we turn philanthropy into a force, not just for good, but a force for justice? There are recent and illuminating examples. The Inspirit Foundation and the Laidlaw Foundation announced a $3.85 million grant to the Foundation for Black Communities to ensure a sustainable base of support for Black-led organizations. Canada Health has recently launched a matching program for donations made to prevent the rise of anti-Asian racism. The Ford Foundation has floated a $1 billion bond whose proceeds will be used to support social impact organizations closer to home. Maytree, which was my home for many years, has invested in creating a rights-based policy. Clearly, all these examples are of philanthropy being engaged not in generosity, but being engaged with justice. You, as gift planners, wealth managers, accountants, institutional investors, have a direct line to donors. You have a responsibility, I believe, to raise the question of justice with them. You can be part of the movement to shift power and influence. And I will leave you with 5 good ideas, which I hope you will take away. And if you implement even one of them, my time with you will have been useful. So my first good idea for you is to use the word racism. Do not shy away from it. Do not use soft proxies such as diversity. Clarify that diversity is a demographic gathering of population statistics, but inclusion or equity is what you do with diversity. Second, present solutions that are systemic. So not just funding homeless people, but investing in structural solutions to homelessness, not simply relieving poverty, but preventing them. Third, tell them that this will take time. Effective philanthropy is hard. It calls for the patience of Job. Urge them to be constant and not give in to the cardinal sin of philanthropy, which is flirtatiousness. Fourth, address the question of leadership with them. If the leadership does not change, if it is not prepared to share power, then the search for equity becomes so much harder. It is easy to have pictures of diversity on your website, but people are getting sophisticated. They are looking at pictures of governance. Exhort them to develop a diversity and inclusion policy which looks at the nuts and bolts of governance. And finally, do not hesitate to speak truth to power. Paul Taylor, who is the CEO of FoodShare in Toronto, has said, it is not enough to create a safe place for equity. It is time to create a brave space for equity. A first stop for your bravery would be to ask if your organization, your customer, your client are engaged with it, if they have a diversity and equity plan. Almost 1 in 4 of the Stats Canada survey did not know if their organization had one. And so, colleagues, I put out a call for bravery for you. And I hope this bravery will start with you by transforming you from gift planners into warriors for justice. And so my final poll question is about these 5 ideas. If you will action any, none, or all of them, I look forward to hearing your responses, and I look forward to engaging with you in your conversation with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator. What an incredible presentation you've given us today. We are getting so many incredible questions in. So thank you so much for making us think this morning on our day 2 here at the Canadian Association of Gift Planners Conference. How are you feeling about this year and what's happened over the last year in terms of philanthropy? Do you think that this will actually help move this mission forward, Senator?
I'm hopeful that this is not a moment in time, but a moment for our times, that this conversation of equity, justice is one that will prevail. The very fact that you have invited me to talk about this is an indicator. Your sector is taking it seriously. I know that civil society is taking it seriously, and I know that lawmakers are taking it seriously as well. But I think it will always be a combination of legislation and behaviors that will move the needle. And in this limited construct of charities, philanthropy, there are many needles to move, and it is in our hands to do so. So I'm by nature an optimistic person, so I'm positive about this.
Let's take us to 2031. Let's pretend in 10 years from now we're having this conversation again. What do you hope's been accomplished in the upcoming decade?
That's an excellent question. And if I look into the future in 2031, I would hope for a number of indicators that tell us that we are on the right track. First, that the civil society framework that we're talking about, charities, not-for-profit foundations, are imbued by the spirit and lives of all Canadians, and not just a few of them. So that would be, and I think, frankly, that will happen. I think that will happen. Second, I would hope that we have transformed our notion of philanthropy from being generous, which we are. Canadians are incredibly generous people, to one for generosity for justice. So that to some extent we have resolved, and systemic inequities are very difficult to deal with. Trust me, I deal with them every day in the Senate when we're dealing with Indigenous issues. 150 plus years of injustice are not going to be wiped off in one term of Parliament. It is going to take time. So I hope we will have made some changes. We've moved the needle. And thirdly, I sincerely hope that the entire framework of charities will have had a structural review in terms of legislation and regulations. It is long overdue. We need it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I do hope we're speaking in 2031. That would be fantastic. Let's talk a little bit about some of the points you brought up today. One of the questions we've had come through are we've seen, and I don't know if you've been following on Twitter, there's been some activity in regards to racism within the sector. And the question that's been posed today is, many white fundraisers are shying away from calling out peers for racism right now. How do we practice allyship around this issue with our own peers? Any advice for us, Senator?
So let me share with you that the word racism is a very strong word. Once you put it out there, you cannot take it back. I am loath to call individuals racist. I am much more comfortable in calling out structures and constructs that are racist, because that's how we will change racism. So people feeling, challenged in calling out, and I think it's best to point out racist behavior and provide specifics on what constitutes racist behavior, as opposed to simply making the jump to calling someone racist. And they may well be so, but the conversation must carry on. I mean, this is not a conversation of division. This must be a conversation of change and collaboration.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I believe in collaboration as well, and I appreciate your thoughts on that. We've had some amazing comments, of course, and some great questions about your session. One of the ones I just have to share with you, because I think this is brilliant, is we've got someone saying, please, CAGP, can we share the senator's presentation with our boards? Because I think, to your point about boards, I think this is a really important step for them to be involved as well. Would you agree, Senator?
Of course, amplify my message the best way you can. And CAGP is frankly brilliant at amplifying messages. So I'm certainly hoping they embrace this one message.
Another great question that's come through is you've talked about, of course, social justice and generosity. You've spoke about philanthropy. Is there an opportunity to do both? You know, are you suggesting one over the other, as opposed to, once again, that word of collaboration?
No, absolutely not. You know, you can be generous, of course, and you can be a warrior for justice. Darren Walker made the distinction between the two in terms of motivation, but motivation at this point of donors. I believe you can combine the generosity impulse, which we all have as human beings, with the justice impulse, which we all should have more of. There is a meeting of the two. And gift planners can release that. I mean, you are the ambassadors, you know, you are the advisors, you have influence, you have privilege, use it.
I often, it's so, you know, obviously I feel the same way, and I've sat in living rooms with, certainly in my legacy giving officer days, where I sat in living rooms and people were sharing, you know, very important information with us, and there was a huge trust factor there. And I agree with you. I think there's a really solid opportunity for us to influence donors, but in a way that really moves everyone's mission forward in a way that's appropriate for donors, of course.
Let me share a fact with the audience that they are probably familiar with. The trend line in charitable giving in Canada, the last figures that we had, is not on a decline. It is going, it has held steady and going up steadily. But when you disaggregate the data, you find that it is a few older, wealthier Canadians who are continue to raise the bar. And who do they give to? They give to, and they are important institutions, hospitals, museums, foundations. They do not give to justice-seeking organizations. And when you disaggregate the data even further, the bulk of donors are small, small donors who cobbled together their monthly donation in a painstaking way, and that number is in decline. So this, you know, if you're a gift planner, you need to take a look at that, because Canadians, particularly young Canadians, are no longer motivated by institutional charity. They want to fund a GoFundMe campaign to send a journalist on an investigative campaign to Kenya or something like that, and then they'll move to something else. They are flirtatious too. So there is a challenge to, on all fronts, to shine the light on justice as the way forward, as opposed to the impulse of a donor.
Really interesting. We have a really interesting question. The question is, are there times when policy hurts rather than helps?
Of course, policy has unintended impacts all the time. Every policy that we review in the Senate, or every piece of legislation, I've now learned to ask the question of, yeah, you're telling me all the good things this law will do. Please tell me about the unintended outcomes of this policy. So I gave you an example of the Income Tax Act and its view of, how charities can spend their money. That has an unintended impact on charities on the ground, on not-for-profits, and the fight for justice. And there are many, many other examples of unintended and harmful outcomes. I'll give you another example from the past. This was a funny one. I wonder how many of you remember the private members bill in the House of Commons to limit the salary of executives in charities at a certain level. Now that colleagues would have had a severe negative impact because we would have seen a flight of talent. I mean, we already have a talent problem. That would have really gutted us. So glad that went nowhere. But think about policy in those ways. Sometimes it has a clearly well-intentioned objective, but then, you know, you have to really examine all the impacts of a policy before you put your heft behind it.
Right. There's lots of support here for you, Senator. And one of the great questions is, what can we do? What can we do as fundraisers and people passionate about gift planning and the charitable sector to help you?
Well, I gave you 5 good ideas. I could add to those, but I think those are some of them may be more challenging than others. Speaking truth to power, using the word racism. It's I understand. It's you have to get your mind around it. But I did give you a very practical idea as well, is to persuade the organizations to work with, to look at themselves, to turn the mirror on themselves. Who do they reflect? And what is their connection with the justice seeking community? How do we, you know, and I don't think consultations are enough. And I know well-meaning organizations say we consulted with so-and-so, our advisor is so-and-so. But that is really not what I'm getting at. I'm getting at a change of persona and a change of governance, which will lead to a change in decision-making and including the decisions of who to fund and how to fund them.
Really interesting. We've got another question here, and someone's asking, what are the barriers in the House of Commons and the Senate to deal with legislative change in terms of the definition of charity?
Oh, I could give you another lecture on that. There are barriers galore, but if political leadership comes to the front on this, and I have received the government's response to the charities report, and one of the elements of the recommendations that they support is reviewing the legal definition of charity and embedding an expanded, modernized version of charity by law, which is what Australia has done. Australia now has 15 different heads of charity. We still have 4. But even then, you know, is it a government bill? Legislation gets moved far more quickly if it's a bill put on the table by the duly elected government of the day. That's democracy. A private bill, especially an unelected senators, oh my gosh, hurdles upon hurdles upon hurdles upon hurdles. There are always people who will object. There are always, you know, reasonable objections. And sometimes the passage of the bill gets delayed by exceptions that are overly magnified. You know, I just have to talk about the COVID crisis as one example, where one issue gets overly magnified and takes center stage, AstraZeneca, for example, as opposed to the larger good that is AstraZeneca. I hope I'm speaking in ways that I'm able to in response to the question. What was the question, Sam? Sorry,
well, we were just talking about. I actually lost my place too. So
I saw the poll result.
Yeah, so we were looking at different ways to sort of think about it from a charity perspective. How can we help? Yeah. So the other thing too is we've got a number of different questions here regarding senior management, leadership. How can we encourage that within Canadians to maybe come to the sector, be part of it, especially at that senior leadership level in terms of not only staff, but boards?
I think that's a really important question. One of the findings in the Senate Charities report is that human resources capacity is the biggest challenge that charities face. It's the biggest line item in any charity's budget, but it is the item that they spend the least amount of time on because they do not have most charities do not have a human resources department. Most charities are facing challenges in recruiting talent, and it has to be, I ran a charity for many years, and I remember simply looking around in fear and anxiety. Who was I going to be able to get? Because all the right people for the job were not interested in the sector because of salary levels. They were not competitive, and especially young talent that is able to connect us with the digital world, even if they are mission, even if their values are relate to the mission, their rightful aspirations for financial growth and independence do not. So what we recommended in the Senate Charities report is the government of Canada pay real attention to this and create a human resources capacity, sort of a back end, which would do the back end job of succession planning. I mean, how many charities can afford a headhunter? So they would become the proxy, and they would also become the capacity builder, would sort of encourage young people to attach themselves to the sector. This is a key issue of the sector. And the government has responded in supportive ways to that recommendation, has signaled to us that they will use the social finance fund, which I hope you all know about. If not, I have to come back for another lecture. Because that's an important intervention as well, that they will use the social finance fund to shore up, because there's money attached to that fund, to shore up the human resource capacity of the sector. And I'm really hoping that this is more than an expression of support, but an expression of action.
I do recall the question we were talking about, Senator. It was about how the barriers in the legislature, and I think you certainly addressed that quite nicely. I mean, it's no secret, Senator, there was a huge scandal, especially in 2020, around charities. Do you think that impacted this sector in a negative way moving forward? Do you think it was something that Canadians sort of maybe looked at charities in a different way?
Well, of course, we would all be hiding our heads in the sand if we didn't acknowledge that the level of trust in charities has fallen, I believe, by 6%, which is significant. And whether that has translated directly or indirectly to a lower level of engagement and donations, I don't know, because you have to factor in the impact of COVID into this. This will be sort of a good research topic for academics. Yes, we has had an impact. Yes, we was, and I continue to say, we is not reflective of the sector as a whole. It was a pretty unique outfit that operated in a very unique manner, and they commingled their boards, the charity board with the social enterprise board. And that is a no-no, and there should be, clear guardrails between two related organizations when there is a flow of money. It's a very unique problem. But help me get that message to the public. It is not charities that are the problem. It really was not a problem for the charitable sector. It was a problem of politics, frankly. And I think we all recognize it for what it was.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this question, Senator. Many of us over the last 13 or 14 months find ourselves up in the middle of the night, maybe worried about something. What's keeping you up?
Oh, what's keeping me up is the health and safety of Canadians. The news does not get better. In fact, where I live in Toronto, it got progressively worse yesterday. And I don't want to weigh in on who's to blame. I don't want to go there. I think this is an unprecedented challenge. We have to hold our feet to the ground and just do what is right to survive the crisis and then to recover from it. And once we're in full recovery mode, it is the charitable sector that will be called on to do the recovery, to participate in the recovery. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to what the budget has to say in support of charities on Monday.
Absolutely. I've got another question here for you. Some criticize your proposed bill because it may require less accountability with less disclosure by reporting in terms of charities. How would you respond to that, Senator?
I would say it's exactly the opposite. Right now, there is no disclosure required of charities to disclose on an annual amount how much money they have spent working with non-charities. It is a CRA fly-by shooting. They pick who to audit. If my bill comes into force, the CRA will be forced to ask that question on an annual return every year so that the CRA will say, oh, what's a small charity located in Surrey, British Columbia, whose mission is to, increase the population of native plants. I'm just making this up as I go.
Yeah.
What are they doing,
Right.
spending so much of their money working with a non-charity? And that would be a clue. And frankly, the accountability argument is a fake argument, because the accountability I propose will be enhanced accountability, because it will not simply ask for the accountability of money. It will ask for the accountability of all that a charity does in partnership with the non-charity, including the sharing of technological resources, space, human resources, etc., etc. So there are, as I said, there are always naysayers. There were always people who prefer the status quo. I'm not a status quo kind of person. I want change.
And that's why we adore you, is there's change needed. Senator, when I think about my own career in the charitable sector, I think back to when I was a young girl in Deep River, Ontario, and my very first time sort of going door to door trying to raise money for a cause. And I still remember that day like it was yesterday. When you look back to when you were a young girl, do you remember a time when, or maybe the first time, charity affected your life in some way?
Well, I'll go back to my opening example. You know, when I was a newcomer to Canada in 1981, I didn't have work. I couldn't get work because I had no work experience. And if you don't have work experience, Canadian work experience, you can't get a job. When you come from overseas, you know, that whole context. And it was that experience of working with others on raising those $800 for the triple stroller. That is branded into my soul as an expression of collective action, which enriches. You know, it enriched me beyond belief. Look, I'm here today because I did that silly reading of palms. You know, I mean, who would have thought? But there it is. You know, it's that experience has really truly been transformational for me.
Take me to 1981. Could you have ever imagined that you would be a senator of this beautiful country?
Not at all. Who would have thought that? I didn't even know we had a Senate. I was so new in 1981. I knew nothing about the country. I was simply struggling to keep my family's head above water. And I was very, very fortunate. I want to tell everyone deserves a champion and a mentor in their lives. And this one executive director of that little local charity saw something in me that nobody else did. And she lifted me up. And I will always say, I can't pay it back to her, but I will pay it forward. And I hope my life of public service is an expression of paying it forward.
When you think about your colleagues in the Senate, who is sort of standing arm to arm with you in this plight in terms of charities? Who are sort of your biggest supporters at the Senate?
Well, I think it's obvious that Senator Mercer, who was the chair of the study, is a co-champion with me, but also the members of the Senate Charities Committee. They were Senator Yona Martin from British Columbia, Senator Rob Black from Ontario, Senator Mike Duffy from PEI, and we have now a collective understanding of the neglect that the sector has suffered through the last 50 years. We have a collective understanding of what we need to do, and we have personal favorites. You know, we are individuals. So I am championing, for example, this change in the Income Tax Act and the Governance Equity Initiative more than others. And I'm really hoping that we will get a home in government for the sector in the budget. So I've been pretty Let me put it this way. The charities sector now is close to half of the time I spend.
Wow.
So it's really become a big part of my legislative life.
Wow. And another great question that we've had here today, we've talked a lot about bringing new people into the sector, of course. Let's talk about young people, because I think that's a really important part of this, the future of fundraising, engaging those young people. What would you say to someone that maybe is thinking about taking maybe that road less traveled in the nonprofit sector?
I think the sector has a key advantage that it has to leverage, and that is its mission. And young people are ideal. You know, they have ideals. That's wonderful. And every research survey that is conducted with young people and work, they want to work within an organization that mirrors their values. So whether they work in corporate Canada or not-for-profit Canada, they seem to have a real desire to be part of something bigger than themselves. And I think that is something to tap into. I also think that the sector needs to engage people differently. You know, engagement is key. As you know, donor advisors know that engagement, keeping donors engaged, is critical. And for that, you probably need the intelligence of young people, because young people understand artificial intelligence, digitization, the way I cannot understand it. Right. I even have a hard time with the chat box.
Me too.
But yeah, I'm glad you do. So I think it's a two-way street. But frankly, we will not be able to embrace young people in the sector appropriately unless the sector becomes recognized by Canadians as a vibrant pillar of our economy. People need to understand that we contribute 8% to the GDP. That is more than the automotive sector. People need to understand we employ 2 million plus people. We are an important sector. We have to rise up and stand up and call attention to ourselves as a significant part of contributing society, as opposed to, oh, the charitable sector, they're nice, they're angels. You know, that's the kind of rhetoric that we really don't need. We need to be taken seriously and substantively.
I have one last question for you. If we revise policy to include poverty prevention, how would there be governmental assurance that this doesn't just benefit middle or upper class people and needs?
Well, if we can move poor people into middle class, then that would be a battle well worth fighting for. But I think every policy will have guardrails around it to prevent that kind of thing. So, you know, I understand the question and I understand the rationale for the question. We simply can't have charities under the cloak of prevention of charity from doing things that are not prevention of charity, but maybe a retention of a status quo of some kind. But it's an excellent question, and I would like to put my mind to it. Whoever asked that, good on you.
There have been some excellent questions today, Senator, and I have enjoyed our time together today. I always watch what you're doing for us, and I'm really grateful. On behalf of everybody here at the Canadian Association of Gift Planners, please accept our thanks today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a joy. Thank you again.